Hey everyone, welcome to a little APUSH review here. Today we're going to focus on women's history. One of the things I've noticed looking at some of the release tests is that there's usually 4 or 5 questions that deal with women's history. However, there's never really a unit where we just kind of focus on the ladies. So what I've done here is I've tried to condense women's history within United States history, obviously, and try to really focus on, the important women throughout our nation's history, the important movements, and I guess important themes. Okay, and so today I'm going to try to, the best I can, kind of put all this information together here. So we're going to focus on women during the Colonial Era, American Revolution, Antebellum. Antebellum being like 1789 to 1860. Progressive Era, 1920s, World War II, 50s, 60s, and 70s. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right. So women in the colonial era. Okay. So let's first of all talk about what was it like to be a woman in the colonial era. Okay. Number one, you're not going to have many political rights at this time. Number two, you're pretty much going to do basically housework and raising babies. Okay. During this time, women had lots of babies, 5 to 7 children. Okay. And as a result, many women came to fear childbirth as a result, because having babies without really any kind of modern medicine is kind of scary, and by kind of I mean really scary. Okay, so we see low divorce rates at the time. Women were not really at the point where they were independent and capable of really leaving their husbands, so you didn't really see a lot of divorces at the time. During colonialism, there's a sharp contrast in I guess what the lives of women were like in New England versus the South. Originally, there's not really a lot of women in the Chesapeake region, so you don't see a lot of families originally at first, whereas in New England you see a lot more. As far as important women that you need to know, Anne Hutchinson, who was in Massachusetts, she was a woman who was very outspoken, held women's meetings in her home, and she challenged Puritan beliefs, which is something you didn't do in Massachusetts. And so she was actually expelled from Massachusetts at the time for challenging the Puritan way of life. And she was sent to what they called the sewer, which is Rhode Island. Okay, women during the American Revolution, we see women taking a little bit more of an active role here. We see women serving as cooks and nurses in army camps. We also see this idea of Republican motherhood popping up, which is something that is very much enforced or reinforced during this time, where women are like they're like in charge of the morality of the nation. That is the women's job to produce good and virtuous citizens that can then help the country, so to speak. Okay, so I guess they're kind of like the nation's conscience. That was kind of the role of the woman, was to produce good children. Okay, as far as any important women of this time, like names to remember, Abigail Adams, the wife of the President John Adams. She very much pushed her husband to remember the ladies, that when they're doing the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, think about what should the rights of women be. Okay, also Sacagawea at this time helped Lewis and Clark. Women during the antebellum period, this is where you're going to really have to focus. There's lots of good stuff here. Depending on what book you have, in the book that we use, there's a chapter on culture and reform. During this period, just hit that hard. Okay. Some of the themes here, in this period, we see a lot more women taking jobs in the private sector. We see textile factories become a very popular job for women, especially ones that aren't married, so we the Lowell factory girls. We also see the cult of domesticity popping up here, which establishes strict gender roles and glorifies the role of the homemaker. A very important thing to remember is the very first Women's Rights Convention is held in 1848 at Seneca Falls. That is where you see the Declaration of Sentiments being created, where they say all men and women are created equal. We also see during this time there is some element of birth control taking place. We do see the birth rate among Americans falling a little bit. And so even though birth control is very taboo, you didn't really talk about it back then, clearly less babies are getting born, and so there is some element of birth control that is starting to take place at this time. Okay, women during this time take a very active role in reform movements, and so even though women couldn't vote at this time, they do start to take a very active role in society. With certain movements like the temperance movement, women's suffrage, abolition, mental health reform. Those are all things that women start to get involved in, and you can see the names that are associated with those movements to remember. Other kind of random things here about 19th century women. At the time of the Civil War, 10% of the women remained single. Okay. Strict gender roles, blah, blah, blah. Important women to maybe remember. You have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, huge into women's suffrage. Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman to graduate medical school. Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's a list of important women from that time. Okay, women in the West are typically seen as women who are treated more equally than other regions of the nation, and you can tell this by looking at when women got the right to vote. If you look at some of these Western states, they were given the right to vote long before women's suffrage was granted by the 19th Amendment in 1920. And so you can see that these Western states maybe are a little bit more progressive than the rest of the country. So women in the West sought a little bit more equality socially, economically, and politically in the West, with Wyoming being the first state in 1890 to grant women the right to vote. Okay, women also take a very active role during the Progressive period. Florence Kelley starts the National Consumers League, which pushes for legislation protecting women and children in the workplace. You also see Jane Addams starting up settlement houses that basically help the poor, help immigrants, help them assimilate into the American life. Once again, the temperance movement, you have to see the Anti-Saloon League getting created, and women's suffrage, led by Susan B. Anthony, are obviously quite successful because they do get suffrage during this time. So you do see women taking a very active role within society by pushing for these social reforms. Okay, Prohibition, which we've talked about at great length. I think we can kind of move on. We talked a little bit about that in my previous podcast. We also see in 1920s, we see once again the women liberating themselves a little bit with the first sexual revolution. Once again, I talked a little bit about this in my previous podcast, but I'll just go ahead and talk a little bit more about it. We see women in the 20s acting a little differently, and when I say women in the 20s, I don't mean all women, but we see some women, these women known as flappers, having new hairstyles. They're swearing, which is very unladylike, but they're driving cars, they're going to bars, they're smoking, they're playing sports. And once again, we have this first sexual revolution here where women start to act more sexy, go on dates unsupervised, kiss boys and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit of what your book calls petting. We see Clara Bow, who's pictured on the right here, who is seen kind of as a sex symbol. We do see women being kind of turned into sexual objects at this time, mainly through advertisement and stereotypes that are established through those advertisements. And I think if you think about how women are portrayed in advertisements today, how women are kind of expected to be the sexier of the sex, so to speak, that you can kind of see that still. We also see women at this time going to college, really, for, I guess, kind of the first time. We see women going into the quote-unquote female professions, nurses, librarians, and typo, nurses. We also see women demanding a little bit more equality within their marriages, trying to push for more say in their relationships with their men, which I think if you think about your home today, I'm assuming that some of you might have, one parent who's maybe the boss, but I think most homes today, you would say marriage has become more of an equal partnership. I know mine has. Anyways, women during World War II, this one's pretty quick. We see women really assisting in the war effort. We see women joining the military. We see women joining the workforce, okay, for really the first time. So 50% of the women that joined the workforce in World War II had never had jobs before. But when the war did end, many of them did have to go home, could go back to the house, to that more traditional role. But 66 or 33%, I should say, do stay in the workforce. So we do see women using World War II as a way to get out of the house, take more of an active role in society and the economy. Okay, so we do see women taking that active role. One of the terms from this time, Rosie the Riveter, from this famous poster here. Anyways, 1950s, we see the kind of the return to the traditional, I guess, view of women. There's kind of this expectation that women, once again, are the caregivers to children, the homemaker, and that stereotype is reinforced with, shows like Leave It to Beaver and stuff like that. Once again, some women are able to enter the workforce as teachers and as nurses. Okay. The 1960s, we really start to see, women really push for equality. This is really the beginning of the feminist movement here. You have The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedman, who basically, her book questions the roles that women have in society. She talks about how unfulfilling life can be as a homemaker, how predictable and boring life can get. And she basically says that women should seek more from life than that. That they should try to find other things that make them happy. Not to suggest that being a homemaker can't make someone happy. But anyways, in 1966, we see the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW, formed. They become a political lobbying group for women's rights. 1968 is a very interesting year for women's rights, for the feminist movement. We see major protests against the Miss America pageant. Specifically, the part of the Miss America pageant where women dress up in swimsuits. And women basically start to reject this idea that they are sex objects for men to drool over. And so one of the protests that takes place during this period is bra burning, where women would literally go and burn their bras at some of these protests. So it's kind of an interesting thing. 1970s, we see some huge things taking place in women's suffrage here, women's suffrage, the feminist movement. Title IX is a major landmark decision in women's equality. It basically prohibits sexual discrimination in any school that receives federal aid, which becomes a huge boost to women's athletics. Basically not suggesting that any school that receives federal money has to give equal access for men's sports and women's sports. So if you have 20 men's sports, you have to offer 20 women's sports, and that's obviously huge for women's sports. Roe V Wade, 1973, made abortion legal on the grounds of privacy. And once again, I think this is an important time to note that birth control and abortion, not once again to talk about the morality of either, but birth control and abortion give women more choice in when they want to have children. Okay, and children obviously get in the way of careers, and so one of the things that allows women to become more independent from men is the ability to support themselves. And so this idea that women can have birth control now, that can let them choose when to have families, is going to allow women to enter the workforce, to start careers, and to become a little bit more socially mobile. And so that's an important development for women in America. Once again, not to get into a debate about the morality of either. Okay, there is an amendment that is proposed during this time called the Equal Rights Amendment that was supposed to make sexual discrimination unconstitutional, but it failed to pass. Actually, it failed by 3 states. There was 3 states short of being added to the Constitution. So it does show there was some resistance towards this movement during this time. Okay, so anyways, that's all I have for today. I hope this helped. Just my Twitter and my website and email address and YouTube channel. So thanks, guys. I hope this helped.